Thank you, Presiding Officer. This morning, Audit Scotland released a damning report on the state of Scotland's NHS. Amongst many shocking figures, people waiting over a year for treatment has jumped from 3,500 to 40,000. That's an 11-fold increase since 2019, despite patient numbers falling. When he was Health Secretary, Humza Yousaf brought in his NHS recovery plan that was supposed to bring waiting times down. So why, First Minister, are things getting worse, not better?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, first and foremost, let me say that we take very seriously the comments in the report by the Auditor General that were published this morning. There's simply no doubt, or indeed attempts by us to downplay the seriousness of the challenges the health service is facing as it recovers from what is undoubtedly the biggest shock of its 75-year existence, the global pandemic. And of course there are challenges for every single health service right across the UK. To answer Douglas Ross's question directly, we are still facing the accumulative impacts of the pandemic. People are still, for example, winter, suffering from COVID. That has an impact not just, of course, on IPC within hospitals, but also, of course, on staff who are able to perform elective care and treatments and surgeries. These are common challenges. I accept, of course, they are my responsibility here in NHS Scotland, as well as the Health Secretaries. These are common challenges right across the country. In fact, if I look at some of the latest data in September last year, it did show that Scotland, there was 123 patients waiting per 1,000 of the population for the treatment time guarantee and new outpatient appointments. That is fewer than in England, where it's 137 per 1,000 on the referral to treatment waiting list. And in Wales, that figure is 245 per 1,000. So my point in making that is that, of course, there are challenges that Scotland's NHS is facing. Of that, there is no doubt. These are common challenges right across the UK, and what we'll do is make sure we fund the NHS, and that's why I'm pleased that in the budget announced by the Deputy First Minister last year that we invested a record £19.5 billion in our health service.
Douglas Ross.
This is an Audit Scotland report into NHS Scotland. Please, First Minister, focus on our NHS here in Scotland. Because that shocking 11-fold increase in people waiting over a year is, of course, against a target which should be zero. There was a target for March 2023 for people waiting over a year to be eradicated. Instead, it is now over 40,000. And Audit Scotland say that the latest SNP targets to reduce waiting times are unlikely to be met. Those are Humza Yousaf's targets. It was his recovery plan. When he was Health Secretary, he said this plan will drive the recovery of our NHS not just to pre-pandemic level, but beyond. Yet another example of Humza Yousaf winging it. That arrogant claim now rings hollow, and patients in Scotland are suffering. Humza Yousaf sent waiting times in the wrong direction. Will he now finally admit his plan has failed?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, here is what we have managed to achieve, and I accept, of course, there's still a way to go, and I accept, of course, the recommendations of the Audit Scotland report. But we have seen, because of the investment that we've made in national treatment centres, an additional 20,000 procedures through the investment in our national treatment centres. It's why we've seen also an increase in the last 12 months, an 11% increase in performed operation over the last year. It's why outpatients waiting longer than 2 years has fallen by almost 70%. Inpatient day case patients waiting the longest fallen by over 25%. And that is why we're investing over £19.5 billion, a record amount, in our National Health Service. What makes that recovery, of course, more difficult is a 10% cut to our capital budget, which means we have less to spend on capital health infrastructure. What makes that job more difficult, Presiding Officer, is only being provided £10.8 million of health consequentials in the UK Government's autumn statement, enough for 5 hours of NHS activity. So while the Conservatives rightly will ask questions about what further we can do, let me say that this SNP government will invest in our NHS, unlike Douglas Ross's party, who are cutting the funding to the bone.
Douglas Ross.
It's not just the Conservatives that are asking these questions, it's Audit Scotland, and crucially, it's our constituents who are suffering. But as usual, Humza Yousaf promised the world and delivered very little. Just like the ferries he claimed he would build, just like the Hate Crime Act that he said would be a success, just like the trains that he promised to get to run on time. Audit Scotland say they can't even fully measure how badly his recovery plan has failed because the SNP has not been transparent with the public. This is what they say. Updates against a range of the ambitions are absent. Humza Yousaf is covering up just how bad it's been. But the reason for this failure is clear from the report. Audit Scotland states there is no overall vision for Scotland's NHS. No overall vision. How can Humza Yousaf and this SNP government have no vision for Scotland's NHS?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, again, we will respond to the Audit Scotland report in due course. But let me say to Douglas Ross that when it comes to the SNP stewardship of our NHS, that stewardship, of course, has seen record investment in our NHS of over £19.5 billion. It has seen resource funding more than double, increased by over 100% since we've been in power. It's showing record staffing in our NHS of over 31,300 whole-time equivalents. There's more nurses in Scotland per head than in England. We have the best NHS staff anywhere in the UK. We have the best performing A&E departments, not for 1 year, not for 5 years, but for 8 consecutive years, Presiding Officer. And because we value our NHS staff, we are the only nation in the UK not to have NHS staff go on strike, Presiding Officer. When it comes to the challenges that our NHS is facing, undoubtedly facing, I'm not downplaying them, this government is making sure that we invest in that recovery. But the difference between the Tories and the SNP, Presiding Officer, is that we will invest in our NHS while the Conservatives are cutting it right down to the bone.
Douglas Ross.
There is no vision for Scotland's NHS. Not my words, but the words of the Auditor-General for Scotland. And they make it very clear that the lack of vision has not just happened because of the pandemic and the issues that our NHS faced. There has not been a vision for Scotland's NHS since 2013. They say, and I quote, "There has been no unified vision for the future direction of the entire healthcare system published since 2013. 2013. Humza Yousaf has no vision for Scotland's NHS. He's been asleep at the wheel like every other SNP First Minister. There's been a lost decade of leadership in Scotland's NHS. 10 years of stalling and delay has had dire consequences for patients. How long are people in Scotland going to have to wait for the SNP to get their act together?
First Minister.
Officer are investing in that recovery now. That's why, for example, those outpatients waiting the longest has reduced by almost 70%. It's why inpatients waiting the longest have reduced by over 25%. It's why operations performed in the last 12 months have increased by 11%. It's why, through our investment, we've created additional capacity for 20,000 procedures. It's why we're investing a record £19.5 billion in our NHS, despite the fact that the UK government, in their autumn statement, provided less than £11 million for NHS health consequentials. That's enough to fund 5 hours of NHS activity, Presiding Officer. So I will take not a single lecture from Douglas Ross about investing in our NHS when his party is responsible for a 10% capital cut in our budget, which is deeply impacting our health infrastructure. Douglas Ross, Presiding Officer, I'm afraid, is presiding over a party that has taken a hatchet to our public services. So while they cut it to the bone, we'll continue to invest in the most precious institution in this country, our National Health Service.